much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. Well, we're in Prussia. The Prussians are coming, the Prussians are coming. Okay? This is what we did last time. And as we started talking about Prussia and the Hohenzollerns, the only dynasty we'll be discussing in Prussia, it's kind of like a mountain. You started off with some fair rulers and so on and so on. And then they got better and better and better and better. Well, they're going to peak with the first guy we're about to talk about. He was the greatest. And then it's kind of downhill from there until you get to Otto von Bismarck, who was Prussian, but he wasn't a ruler. He was the chancellor or prime minister. But I don't know if we'll get to him today or not. It all depends on how fast I talk and how slow you listen, I guess. Okay. And okay, so without further ado, who are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, who had a pretty long reign, 1740 to 1786. And here's what he looked like. No other Prussian king had so much influence over Europe, the history of Europe, than Frederick the Great. When Frederick the Great succeeded his father, Frederick William I, who we ended up talking about last time before we did the little thing about the fathers and sons, he inherited a large, well-trained army, which he, unlike his father, will use frequently. That same year that he became king of Prussia, that's the same year that Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg lands of Austria. Talked about her last time. For which, by the way, her father Charles VI had, remember, he had to promulgate the previously discussed pragmatic sanction because he rightly feared that they weren't going to honor her inheritance of the throne. And they didn't, but she had to fight for it, and she lost a big chunk of Austria in the process to Frederick the Great, by the way. In fact, Frederick the Great was the first one to challenge her inheritance when he started what came to be known as the First Silesian War, which we talked about last time. And this encouraged other states to attack, which that morphed into the War of the Austrian Succession, which we also talked about last time. Frederick the Great's successes forced Maria Theresa to conclude peace with Prussia, and that's how Prussia lost Silesia in 1742. Here's a map that kind of shows that. This area, this is Silesia, that previously was part of Austria, became part of Prussia. Here's Brandenburg, Prussia right here, and they're going to take over this land right here. Today, I think most of Silesia, which is very rich, very mineral rich, natural resources, a lot of factories there. I think most of it today is in Poland today, okay? But Frederick feared an attack from Maria Theresa, thought she'd be getting even with him. And to regain Silesia. And Maria Theresa forged a powerful coalition against Prussia, consisting of Austria, Russia, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, and Sweden. Prussia's only allies were Great Britain, the German Kingdom of Hanover, from whence came England's current ruling dynasty, and a few other smaller German principalities. But Frederick the Great had an ace in the hole. And that was the Prussian army. That was widely admired in Europe by this time for its capabilities. In 1756, he forestalled his enemies by attacking Saxony, which he hoped to incorporate with Prussia. Didn't quite work out that way yet. But unlike the Silesian Wars, Frederick failed to deliver a quick, decisive blow to the Austrian army. Instead of the expected short war, the conflict developed into the 7-year-long War of Attrition, in which the Prussian army, despite several successful battles in the early going, was shrinking fast and gradually forced to retreat. The only thing that saved Prussia was the dissolution of the enemy coalition that Maria Theresa had worked so hard to put together as a result of Frederick's admirer Tsar Peter III of Russia was an admirer of Frederick the Great and didn't want to fight him. So there went all of Maria Theresa's plans and her alliance. By the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, Prussian territory included Silesia, and in 1772, Frederick annexed the Polish Royal Prussia. Remember, part of Prussia, which eventually is going to be called East Prussia, was actually a fief of the Polish king granted to the King of Brandenburg, the Prussian king back in Brandenburg. But in 1772, Frederick just annexed it, thus linking his kingdom of Prussia in the east with Brandenburg and the main body of his German possessions in the west. Now, Frederick was a proponent of enlightened despotism, or enlightened absolutism, it's sometimes called. He was a product of the Enlightenment. He continued to modernize the Prussian bureaucracy and civil service, and he pursued religious policies throughout his realm that ranged from tolerance to oppression. It all depended on who you were and where you were as to which you got. He reformed the judicial system and made it possible for men not of noble stock to become judges and senior bureaucrats, previously not allowed. Frederick was a patron of music as well, he was a gifted musician who played the transverse flute, whatever that is, and he composed over 100 sonatas for the flute, as well as 4 symphonies. The Hohenfriedberger March, a military march, obviously, was supposedly written by Frederick to commemorate his victory at the Battle of Hohenfriedberg during the Second Silesian War. A meeting with Johann Sebastian Bach in 1747 in Potsdam led to Bach's writing the musical offering, which was written in Frederick's honor. Frederick also aspired to be the classic, I guess we could say, Platonic philosopher king, like the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The king joined the Freemasons in 1738 and stood close to the French Enlightenment, corresponding with some of its key figures, such as Voltaire, who wrote and published The Private Life of the King of Prussia, wittily describing Frederick's homosexuality. We talked about that a little bit last time. And parade of male lovers after he had left Prussia, he wrote it. Frederick neither admitted nor denied the contents of the book. Some years later, Voltaire and Frederick resumed their correspondence and eventually aired their mutual recriminations against each other to end as friends once more. Now, I don't know, is it worth discussing, considering, or thinking about, was Frederick a homosexual? Most think he was. For some people and for some reasons, some people think this is a very important topic. I don't know why. Publications of the LGBTQ community do claim him as one of theirs. They sometimes list famous homosexuals in history, and he's always included. After Katz, remember his lover, Kat was executed by his father. Told you about that last time. Frederick was forced to marry Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Bevern, with whom he had no children. He immediately separated from his wife when Frederick William died in 1740, the year he inherited the throne. In later years, Frederick would pay his wife formal visits only once a year. In addition to his, although also he spoke many languages, in addition to his native language, German, he also spoke French, Italian, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. He also understood Latin and both ancient and modern Greek and Hebrew. So the guy was no slough, that's for sure. Some critics, however, point out his oppressive measures against his conquered Polish subjects. Frederick supported artists and philosophers he favored, but at the same time enacted several laws censoring the press, and others he did not favor. After the peace of 1763, ending the 7 Years' War, Frederick was forced to spend a lot lot of time, effort, and money to rebuild his war-torn kingdom and severely depleted army. But a new significant territory was gained when Prussia participated in Poland's first partition in 1772 with Austria and Russia, whereby the land between the original Prussian duchy and Brandenburg was incorporated into Prussia. Poor Poland. You know, you talk about geographic advantages. Poland's a perfect example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time forever. I mean, here's Poland and surrounded by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Good luck. Good luck hanging on to whatever you have or wish you had or used to have. Frederick the Great was also successful in frustrating Austria's attempts to expand into Germany, which was the cause of the War of the Bavarian Succession, 1778-79. When Frederick died in 1786, he left a kingdom that was considerably larger than the one he had inherited, and which possessed incredible prestige in Europe, mostly, once again, because of its 200,000 man strong army. And here's some maps to illustrate. This is showing Brandenburg at the time of the purchase by the Hohenzollerns. The shaded in areas was Prussia. That was Prussia. And then a few years later, at the time of Frederick William, the Great Elector, see the expansion, the shaded in area? This is the ducal. This is East Prussia. That was a fief owned by the King of Poland. That is until Frederick the Great took it. And then at the end of Frederick the Great's reign, this shaded in area is Prussia. Big difference, huh? Big difference. It is probably worth pausing to reflect on the man who single-handedly launched the 3 Silesian Wars and remained the custodian of Hohenzollern territories for 46 years, nearly as long as his illustrious predecessor, the Great Elector. The persona of this gifted, spirited monarch enthralled contemporaries and has fascinated historians ever since. Getting a sense of who the king was is no simple matter, however, for Frederick was enormous and very wordy. His posthumously published writings run into 30 volumes, but are rarely self-revealing. Doesn't like talking about himself that much. His writing and speech reflected a essential 18th century esteem for the spirit, esprit, as the French say. The style was highly proverbial, light and economical, the tone always detached. Encyclopedic knowledge, amused, ironic, and even mocking. But behind the labored gags of the satirical verses and the cool, reasoned prose of the historical memoirs and the political memoranda he wrote, the man himself remains elusive. About the superiority of his intellect, there can be no doubt. Throughout his life, Frederick devoured books, and some of these people I've never heard of, devoured books by Fenelon, Descartes, Molière, Bayle, Boileau, Brosset, Corneille, Racine, Voltaire, Locke, Wolfe, Leibniz, Cicero, Caesar, Lucian, Horace, Grisset, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, Tacitus, Livy, Plutarch, Sallust, Lucretius, Cornelius Nepos, and hundreds more. His library was almost unending. He was always reading new books, but he also regularly reread the texts that were most important to him. I do that all the time because I forget that I read this 10 years earlier. I'll read about some book in some bibliography and think, boy, that sounds interesting, so I'll order it. I always buy a used one on Amazon because you can get them for about $1 if you. And I'll be reading it, I'll get halfway through it, and I'll think, wait a minute. I'll go, oh, here it is right here. Happens all the time. In one of the 18th century's funniest effusions of literary bile, Frederick, a grumpy old man of 68 at this time, denounced the German language as semi-barbarian idiom, which is physically impossible, he said, that's a quote, physically impossible, even for an author of genius to achieve superior aesthetic effects. German writers, the king wrote, and I quote once again, take pleasure in a diffuse style. They pile parentheses upon parentheses, and often you don't find until you reach the end of the page the verb on which the meaning of the entire paragraph depends. Unquote. That's what he said about that. Okay? So visceral was Frederick's need for the company and stimulation of books that he had a mobile field library fitted for use during military campaigns. Keep him occupied at night, I guess. Writing, he usually wrote in French, was always important, not just as a means of communicating his thoughts to others, but also as a psychological refuge. It was always his aspiration to combine the daring and resilience of the man of action with the critical detachment of the philosopher. His coupling of the two species, encapsulated in the youthful self-description as a philosopher king, meant that neither of his roles had an absolute claim over him. He passed as a philosopher among kings and a king among philosophers. His letters from the battlefield at the lowest points in his military fortunes contains the true Stoics' fatalism and immunity from care. The essays on practical and theoretical matters, conversely, breathe the confidence and authority of one who is used to wielding real power. The relationship between Frederick's political writings and his practice as a ruler was remarkably straightforward. Always at the center of his thinking was the power of the state, the all-important state, the government. An early essay he wrote with a misleading title, the title was The Anti-Machiavel, set out quite clearly his position on the permissibility of the preemptive strike in order to advance the cause of his people, which reminds one of his invasion of Silesia right after Maria Theresa became the ruler of Austria. He was even more outspoken on in his two political testaments he left for his successor, in which he suggested how nice it would be if Prussia could absorb Saxony and Polish Prussia in order to round out the borders and make it more defensible. Hint, hint, hint. Frederick was also a formidable and highly organized and original historian. His chief works, History of the House of Brandenburg, History of My Own Times, and History of the 7 Years' War, three books he wrote, make up the first comprehensive treatment of the rise of early Prussia. His notes are so coherent that they still today serve as primary source material for historians of the period. Unfortunately, Frederick's fame is dwindling in modern Germany today. He is seen, surprise, surprise, as an anachronism. In history, it is argued all judgments of the past reflect those who judge much more than the subject of the judgment in the first place. It's like the list of the greatest presidents. Every once in a while, every 10 years, the American Historical Society publishes they do a survey of American historians and have them list the presidents. Well, Lincoln and Washington are always first, but after that, it's every man for himself, okay? And the list says more about the historian making the list than it probably does the presidents in the first place. Appropriate thing to mention the day after President's Day, right? Okay, thought I'd bring that up. Of course, it doesn't help Frederick's case that both Napoleon and Hitler were among his admirers. And I don't know, while it may be fair to judge one by their friends, but probably not so if those friends come after you. All right? Near the end of his life, Frederick grew increasingly solitary. His circle of friends at Sanssouci, his palace in Potsdam, gradually died off without replacements. And Frederick became increasingly critical and arbitrary, to the frustration of the civil service and the officer corps. The populace of Berlin always cheered the king when he returned to the city from provincial tours or military campaigns or reviews or what have you. But Frederick took no pleasure from his popularity with the common folk, preferring instead the company of his pet Italian greyhounds, whom he referred to as the Marquise de Pompadour, as a joke, a jibe at the French royal mistress of Louis XV. Frederick died in an armchair in his study at the palace at Sanssouci on August 17, 1786. Frederick had wished to be buried next to his greyhounds on the vineyard terrace at Sanssouci, but his nephew and successor, Frederick William II, instead ordered the body to be entombed next to his father in the Potsdam Garrison Church. As mentioned earlier, near the end of World War II, Hitler ordered Frederick's coffin to be hidden in a salt mine to protect it from destruction. U.S. Army located it and reburied it next to the Burg Hohenzollern. After German reunification in 1991, the body was entombed in the Kaiser Friedrich Mausoleum at Sanssouci's Church of Peace. On the 205th anniversary of his death, on August 17, 1991, Frederick's casket lay in state with the Court of Honor at Sanssouci, covered by a Prussian flag and escorted by an honor guard. After nightfall, his body was finally laid to rest on the terrace of the vineyard at Sanssouci, without pomp, in accordance with his last will. And if you ever visit Sanssouci at Potsdam, you'd be walking along and all of a sudden you just look over off the walkway and there it is. That's his plaque that denotes his grave, Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great. One interesting character. Okay. Next comes Frederick William II. Here's Frederick William, 1786, 1797. The next two Prussian kings will be a study in contrast. The next two, this one and the next one, since each was practically the opposite of the other. Since Frederick the Great died childless, his nephew, Frederick William II, inherited the throne. Upon the death of Frederick the Great, the French Count Mirabeau wrote, and I quote, "Everything has collapsed into smallness, just as before everything had expanded into greatness." What a nice thing to say. You know, that would be a suitable grave marker or epitaph. The uncle, Frederick the Great, was misanthropic, aloof, and utterly uninterested in women, as we discussed. The nephew, Frederick William II, was genial, gregarious, and heterosexual, and did his best to prove it every chance he got. His marriage to Elizabeth of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel was dissolved because of infidelities, reputedly by both. The second marriage to Friederike Louise of Hessen-Darmstadt bore him 7 children. At the same time, 7 other children were born of his longtime relationship with his mistress, Wilhelmina Enke. Later came 2 more bigamous morganatic marriages. Morganatic marriage is one in which the children are prohibited from inheriting the throne. Morganatic. That's what that means. Usually because of some disapproving older member of the family. What before had differentiated Prussia from perhaps many of the other dynasties of Europe had vanished, as Frederick William II fit the usual mold of French, English, or Spanish monarchs, at least in terms of whether or not they're going to honor their marriage vows. Okay? But one should still give credit to Frederick William, as he was a patron of the arts and an architecture. He is the one who built the Brandenburg Gate, which is right in downtown Berlin on the Unter von Linden. Is that what it's called? Unter van Linden, something like that. But be that as it may, and the famous a structure it is, he was incapable of providing the strong leadership necessary for a state like Prussia in a very, very dangerous world. The late 18th century Europe. Late 18th century Europe, folks. 1789. French Revolution. Look out. Look out. This weakness opened the door for the emergence of the so-called antechamber of power. That is, powerful ministers who came to the fore, who could steer Prussia in the right direction if the king couldn't, and Frederick William couldn't. Indeed, Prussia was fortunate to possess at this low ebb in its history such able and energetic reformers as Baron von Stein, Karl August von Hardenberg, and Wilhelm von Humboldt. Humboldt has a university named after him in Berlin, but Humboldt State University up in Arcata, California, where all my friends that went there, they all majored in recreational agriculture. And I lived such a sheltered life and was so naive. I had recreational agriculture. What's that? What's that? I probably was in my 30s when I realized what they were saying to me, you know. But I'm sorry, if there are any Humboldt State grads here, I apologize. That's just what they told me. It's not my fault, okay? But Humboldt State is not named for him. It's named for his brother, who was a naturalist and an explorer. And these men helped transform Prussia into a progressive state by abolishing serfdom and noble privileges, introducing agrarian and other social and economic reforms, and laying the groundwork for an exemplary system of universal education. Later, the envy of the world. Some say the German education system is still the envy of the world. Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August Graf von Gneisenau, at the same time, put the Prussian army on a modern basis. As far as foreign policy is concerned, we have a major irony here. Frederick William II's reign was marked by a weakening of Prussia's power, but yet known for its territorial expansion. I mean, its power weakened and weakened, but yet it gained a lot of territory. Mostly at the expense of next door neighbor Poland, which I've kind of already talked about that. Here's the Polish second and third partitions of Poland. This area right here, and they're going to lose all of this area right here. And different nations, I can't read them, will take it over. It's like I said, poor Poland. They're in the wrong place at the wrong time. In 1793 and 1795, together with the inheritance of the Margravites of Ansbach and Bayreuth, meant a great increase in Prussia's territory, but it could not hide the fact that its finances and the quality of its army were deteriorating. And this is the wrong time in European history you want to have that. It is most ironic that during the reign of perhaps the most unimpressive monarch to come to the throne in over a century and a half, he was able to secure for his nation more territory than any other king of his dynasty. Indeed, Prussia increased its size by more than 1/3 in area and almost that much in population. Thanks to all of this, Prussia lost no time in extracting themselves from the anti-French coalition, probably a good idea, in 1795. Luckily for him, Frederick William had to only deal with the early part of the French Revolution since he died in 1797. His major concern here was the welfare of the royal family of France, Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette. The revolution in France produced better relations with Austria that will last well into the 19th century. On August 27th, 1791, Frederick William and the Habsburg Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II issued the famous and ill-fated Declaration of Pillnitz, named after the little town of Pillnitz, in which was really no more than a statement of opposition to the French Revolution, with an accompanying threat to execute any rebels, any French rebels, who in any way, shape, or form harm the royal family, the Declaration of Pillnitz. But it prompted the French Republic to declare war on its authors, Austria and Prussia, which, as the Prussian and Austrian forces, remember, moved on Paris, things went very well until September 20th. The Battle of Valmy, where the new French army defeated the Allies, the Austrians and the Prussians. From there on, it was all downhill, as Prussia soon lost all of its land west of the Rhine, of which it had quite a bit. And it will be up to Prussia's next king to deal with the upstart from Corsica, the little corporal, Napoleon Bonaparte. On November 16, 1797, Frederick William died in Potsdam. He was succeeded by his son, Frederick William III, who had resented his father's lifestyle and acted swiftly to deal with what he considered the immoral state of the court. Frederick William II is buried in Berlin Cathedral, where you'll find him today. So let's talk about his son, Frederick William III. There's a picture of Frederick William III. As I said earlier, these two Prussian kings were a study in contrast of each other. Frederick William III was nothing like his father, but unfortunately for Prussia, he was nothing like his grandfather either, Frederick the Great. But to be fair, his grandfather never had to deal with the likes of Napoleon Bonaparte, as Frederick William III joins those other unfortunate rulers of the time who will be more or less swept aside by the Napoleonic tidal wave. The new king wasted no time to prove his willingness to show his disapproval of his father's way of life. He began by cutting back on the wasteful expenses of the royal establishment by dismissing his father's ministers. Probably not a good idea, because his father's ministers, remember, were pretty good. And reforming the most oppressive abuses of the late reign. The father had pursued territorial prizes at every conceivable opportunity. The son was a man of peace who eschewed the quest for glory and reputation. The father's reign saw the last exuberant grasp of Baroque monarchy with its displays of wasteful splendor and bevies of mistresses. The son was austere in his decorative tastes, and for all we know, seems to have remained faithful to his wife. Frederick William III found the city palace in Berlin too imposing a place to live and preferred to stay in the smaller residence he had occupied as crown prince. His favorite ordinary country squire, to behave like an ordinary country squire, Frederick William drew a clear distinction, unlike his predecessors, between his private life and his public functions. He was painfully shy and disliked elaborate public occasions at court. He was shocked when he once learned that his children referred to him in his absence as the king instead of Papa. He didn't like that. He enjoyed lightweight comedies at the theater, partly because he enjoyed being in the company of others as long as he wasn't the center of attention. However, he had the Hohenzollern determination to retain personal power, but not the Hohenzollern genius for using it correctly. Too distrustful to delegate responsibility to his ministers, he became a micromanager. And like most micromanagers, they end up managing nothing and messing things up. Disgusted with the moral debauchery of his father's court in both political intrigues and sexual affairs, Frederick William's first endeavor was to restore morality to his dynasty. On Christmas Eve, 1793, Frederick William married Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. there's Louise, who bore him 10 children. In the Crown Prince's palace at Berlin, Frederick William lived a civil life with a problem-free marriage, we assume, which did not change even when he became King of Prussia in 1797. His wife, Louise, was particularly loved by the Prussian people, which boosted the popularity of the whole House of Hohenzollern, including the king himself. But when she died, she seems to have taken this popularity of the king with her to the grave. The king's weak and vacillating personality was just not likable. All of these negatives began to add up when Napoleon Bonaparte came knocking at the door. At first, he endeavored let's leave him up there. First, he endeavored to maintain neutrality in the Napoleonic Wars. But as the world soon learned, some sooner, some later, when Hitler came knocking on the door, along with another recently guy by the name of Vladimir Putin, when they come along, aggressors are not impressed with those who want to be neutral, for the most part, and will laugh at their desire to be left alone. In 1806, French troops were massed on Prussia's frontier, and Frederick William had no choice but to take up arms against France. His crushing defeat by the French at Jena and the resulting humiliation at the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, which virtually made Prussia a French vassal, served to awaken the king to the need of the reconstruction of the Prussian army. Unable to carry through the reforms himself, he was at least farsighted enough to appoint capable ministers. The reforms of the previously mentioned ministers of Stein, von Hardenberg, and Scharnhorst laid the basis of the modern Prussian state and prepared for the eventual wars against Napoleon. Forced to send an auxiliary force to aid Napoleon's Russian campaign. A lot of people don't know it, but as Russia marched on Moscow, he made some of his conquered enemies, the Austrians and the Prussians, made him go with them. They had to send regiments also. And Hitler did the same thing. When Hitler marched on Moscow and on Stalingrad, the Spanish were forced to send regiments to help him out. A lot of people don't realize that. The king was finally persuaded to support, after all of this, to support the Convention of Turagin. Turagin was concluded with the Russians after Napoleon began his retreat from Moscow. And he was on the run. General York von Wartenberg, in which the Prussian general declared his army no longer part of Napoleon's Grand Army, and instead was neutral, thus allowing the Russians to pursue the greatly weakened Napoleon back to France. A few weeks later, a military alliance with Russia was signed, and in March 1813, the king declared war on France. After Napoleon's defeat, and the victors met and convened at the Congress of Vienna, which he attended, by the way, Frederick William and his ministers were successful in gaining territory at the conference, which was quite an accomplishment considering they had helped Napoleon in his march on Russia in 1812. And here are the two maps that show Prussia before and after the Congress of Vienna. All of this darkened area down here is all added to Prussia that's not there. All at the expense, by the way, of some of the smaller German states in that area. Now, influenced by Tsar Alexander I and by Austrian Prime Minister Metternich, talked about him several times before, he joined the Holy Alliance and refused to grant the constitution he had promised, as he became part of the reactionary spirit that guided the Congress of Vienna. And that was personified in these other two men, mainly Metternich. Remember Metternichism represents the conservative way of dealing with foreign affairs after the Congress of Vienna. These actions, together with the death of his consort, Queen Louise, as mentioned, far more popular than the king was, and she died in 1810, led to his continuing unpopularity with the Prussian people for the rest of his reign. In 1824, he remarried, once again, morganatically, Countess Auguste von Harrach, the Princess of Liegnitz. They had no children. Frederick William III died on June 7, 1840, in Berlin from a fever, and was survived by his second wife. His eldest son, Frederick William IV, succeeded him. Frederick William III is buried at the mausoleum in Charlottesburg, Berlin, the mausoleum of Charlottesburg in Berlin. His second son will later become Emperor William I of the German Empire after unification of Germany. Frederick William III. So who's next? Frederick William IV. I told you, Frederick William, they love that name. Frederick, the new king. Frederick William IV. Interesting fellow. Interesting fellow. Thanks to his father's long reign, he was already 45 years old when he ascended the throne. He was something of a puzzle, even to those who knew him well. His predecessors, Frederick William III, Frederick William II, and Frederick the Great, all had been educated in the spirit and values of the Enlightenment. The new king, by contrast, was a product of the Romantic era, the Romantic movement, which was a reaction against the Enlightenment. Romanticism emphasized emotion over reason. A lot of romantics running around today, aren't there? Don't get me started. I won't mention any names. Don't worry. The romantics love to glorify the past. They loved nature, for example. The new king had grown up on a diet of romantic history novels featuring high-minded knights, damsels in distress, windswept crags, ancient castles, gloomy forests, and yes, Dungeons and Dragons. Frederick William IV was a romantic, not only in his tastes, but also in his personal life. He wept frequently. His letters to friends often contained heartfelt, sentimentalist thoughts accompanied with batches of up to 7 exclamation points. Frederick William IV was the last Prussian, perhaps the last European monarch, to place religion at the center of his understanding of kingship. He was often called the theologian on the throne, for whom religion and politics were inseparable. At times of stress and high drama, he turned instinctively to biblical language and precedents. But his Lutheran Christianity was not merely a matter of images and formulations. It shaped his policies and affected his choice of advisors. Long before the death of his father in 1840, the crown prince surrounded himself with like-minded Christian friends. For his skeptical younger brother, Prince William, who would be his successor, it was clear that the throne had fallen into the hands of a sect of enthusiasts, as he called them. Prince William complained that these fanatics had been able to gain complete control of his entire person and his fickle imagination. These were men who had been involved with the great Protestant awakening of the 1810s that was sweeping Europe and America at the time. Some of them had close ties with the Pietist and Lutheran separatist movements on the fringes of the Prussian state church. For Frederick William IV was also, and also for his father, the Prussian state was a Christian institute. However, whereas Frederick William III had set out to impose his own eclectic brand of Calvinist Lutheranism, whatever that is, on the Protestant congregations of Prussia and antagonized Prussia's Catholics, by seeking a confrontation over the issue of mixed marriages. His son's Christianity was broader and more ecumenical. To his consternation, his father, Frederick William IV, chose to marry a Catholic princess, Elizabeth of Bavaria, and insisted that she be allowed to convert to Lutheranism in her own time, which she eventually did. His outspoken support for the refurbishment and completion of the great cathedral at Cologne, or Cologne, however you want to say it. Beautiful cathedral. It's right on the Rhine. One of the best examples of Gothic architecture you'll ever find. Hopefully it won't burn down. Reflected not only a characteristically romantic taste for the Gothic style, but also his determination to acknowledge Catholicism. Remember, he's a Lutheran, he's a Protestant, but he wanted the completion of this cathedral as an acknowledgement to the importance of Catholicism in the Prussian heritage. Okay? Frederick William was not a liberal, nor, on the other hand, was he an authoritarian statist conservative. But it was clear that the Romantic movement was wasted on him. The governmental conservatism of the post-Napoleonic era was rooted in the authoritarianism, or the authoritarian strand of the Prussian Enlightenment. But as mentioned, Frederick William was steeped in the ideology of counter-Enlightenment Romanticism. He was not opposed to representative bodies as such, but they had to be, as he said, natural. What does that mean? Or organic. It's like organic food. What does that mean? Or grown. In other words, they had to correspond to the natural and God-given hierarchy of human status and accomplishment as he envisioned it. Don't ask. Underlying his vision of politics and history was an emphasis on continuity and tradition, a response, some say, to the trauma he experienced in 1806 as he fled eastwards with his mother from the advancing French and his mother's sudden death in 1810. Frederick William's attitude to the modern bureaucratic Prussian state was ambivalent. The state did not, in his view, embody the living forces of historical continuity. Rather, it was an artificial thing whose claim to universal authority violated the older and more sacred authority of the locality and the congregation, the local congregation. The king was thus more a supreme administrator, and certainly more than the first servant of the state. He saw himself as a sacred father figure, bound to his people in a mystical union and gifted by God with a peerless understanding of his subjects' needs. Well then, the question soon became, how does all this play out when the cataclysmic revolutionary year of 1848 arrives? By the 1840s, the Prussian political system was living on borrowed time. Under the state indebtedness law, passed in 1820, the Prussian government could not raise taxes or get loans without the consent of a National Estates Assembly, or Diet. Remember the Diet, the old Diet of the Holy Roman Empire. These assemblies, holdovers from the days of the Holy Roman Empire, tied the government's hands unless it agreed to further liberal demands for more representative government or other demands that would evolve in the future. If you have to have this elected estate, well, the people who get elected are the people who hate monarchy and want a republic. And they're not going to grant any taxes unless the king grants what they want. So, nothing happened. Among Frederick William's other passions was the railroad. He correctly saw that the railroad as a source of Prussian military and economic power. But railroads are expensive to build. Just ask our last two governors. They'll tell you. Okay. When the French embarked on a massive railway project, Frederick William had had enough. The king granted permission for convening a nationwide diet in early 1847. It was to be called the United Diet, since it would unite all the provincial diets into one body. Delegates would be seated by locality and estate, and voting was to be by head, and the assembly would meet as one body, pretty much like a national parliament. But there would be two houses, upper and lower. The upper house would be the nobles, princes, and the royal family. And the lower house, called the curia of the three estates, would represent the landed nobles, towns, and peasants. The authorization for the diet made clear the only business that would be discussed would be raising taxes and a loan for railway construction. For the first time in Prussian history, liberals and radicals used the United Diet as a stage for launching their demands to establish a true representative legislature that met at its leisure, not the king's. And until this demand was met, they would not even discuss the king's demands. This sounds like France 1789, doesn't it? But what the United Diet did do was ignite the spirit of revolution that would explode the following year. By February 1848, Berliners were accustomed to news of revolution. Swiss liberals, for example, had just fought and won a civil war that established a liberal constitutional government. But as usual, it was news from France that electrified the city. King Louis Philippe, who had ruled since 1830, had abdicated the throne. So once again, the French were successful in overthrowing an unpopular king, although like all their previous revolutions, this one would also soon turn against those who brought it about. As excitement grew, people rushed into the many coffee houses in Berlin to discuss the latest dispatches from France. On the night of March 13th, a very nervous chief of police ordered more troops into the city of Berlin to preserve law and order. That evening, there were several clashes in which several civilians were killed. The crowd grew in size and became more antagonistic. The Berlin police at this time were guided by an elaborate and somewhat ridiculous legal ritual. As the crowds confronted them, first they had to read the Riot Act of 1835 3 times. This is where the expression, "read 'em the Riot Act," comes from, okay? Which every first-year public school teacher knows what that's all about. And it was a long act, about 3.5 pages. Had to read it 3 times. Then a warning of drums or trumpet 3 times was sounded, after which the order to attack would be given. Only after those previous events had taken place. Soon it became a game. As the crowds approached, the troops, who would dutifully go through their ritual up to the last measure, and then they would quickly disperse, only to meet again a few minutes later and start the whole process all over again. Anyone wearing a uniform and caught alone in the city could be killed, and several were. The king and his advisors vacillated over what to do. Their discussions centered on a set of concessions. Should they give in to the mob, let them have what they want, or send in the troops? And I'll let you think about that over our break while you try to decide what they're going to do, okay? Well, did you all discuss over what's poor Frederick William IV going to do? What's he going to do? All these people want him to do these different things to appease the mob, or... Well, then, in the midst of all this going on, while they're still sitting around trying to decide in the palace what to do, news came from Austria. The ultra-conservative Prime Minister Metternich had resigned following 2 days of revolutionary upheaval in Vienna. Back in Berlin, 2 days later, the king announced the abolition of censorship and the granting of a constitution for the Kingdom of Prussia. But a rally had already been planned in the city for the next day, and even though the government had repeatedly broadcast the news of the concessions, it was too late. The chief of police told the king that he should flee the city. But the king told him that he was too much of a pessimist. The king then walked outside, out onto the street, toward the crowds who had begun to gather. And they cheered, they began to cheer their king, admiring him for his bravery or stupidity, whatever, take your pick. But once again, it was too late. The army had already been ordered in, and soon gunfire erupted, and barricades were set up all over Berlin. And that's a painting. See, that flag is the current flag of Germany today. It was the revolutionary flag back in 1848. It has since pretty much been proven that the first gunshots were on the part of the troops, but they were accidental. But as in other instances of similar actions, it didn't matter. As soldiers attempted to clear the streets, civil war broke out, and many were killed on both sides. The commanding general of the army recommended that the city be abandoned so that massive artillery bombardment could commence from outside Berlin. The king smiled and fired the general on the spot and went to his writing table to pen an appeal to the people of Berlin that began, and I quote, "To my dear Berliners." Then through the course of the document, he promised to order the troops out of the city while he alone would remain. The king had placed himself in the hands of the revolution. At this point, Prince William, the king's younger brother, and later heir, angrily denounced his brother as a coward, and in the presence of his advisors, put on a disguise and left the city. Apparently, he didn't think that was being cowardly at all. But the king's action worked. The troops were pulled out, and peace was restored. The king emerged from what is now called the March Revolutions, untarnished by the violent events of March of 1848. 4 days later, the king traveled to Potsdam to address the commanders of the withdrawn troops who were seething with anger at their withdrawal, being ordered to withdraw from Berlin. He told them he never felt safer than in the arms of his citizens. One eyewitness to this event reported that these words were met with a rattling of swords in their scabbards, such as the King of Prussia should never have to hear again. And that's a quote. The witness who penned that was Otto von Bismarck, who we'll be hearing from a lot later. Within just a few months, the king had another opportunity to make a momentous history-making decision. This time would dash the hopes of liberals and nationalists. After the failure of the 1848 revolts frustrated liberals, because William eventually changed the rules so much with who could run, who could elect, who could vote for this new, under the auspices of this new constitution, that the liberals were all dashed. Their hopes were dashed. But he managed to hold elections over all of Germany to send delegates to Frankfurt. All the liberals decided to take everything into their own hands. They decided to, on their own, announce elections to delegates to meet in Frankfurt, the capital of Baden in Western Germany. This became the first German-wide elective body and was called the Frankfurt Parliament, or sometimes the Frankfurt Assembly. Its delegates were made up primarily of middle-class liberals and nationalists. Back in those days, nationalists and liberals loved each other. I don't think that's true today anymore. After almost a year of debate and argument, it passed a resolution calling for a united Germany, minus Austria, mind you, because there were no Austrians present, with a Prussian ruler, Frederick William IV, to be its king. In essence, the assembly offered him the crown of what would have been arguably, instantaneously, at that moment, the most powerful nation in the world. Germany was now highly industrialized, rich in natural resources, best equipped, best trained army of Europe, off and on. He would have been the most powerful man in the world. Okay? Frederick William IV. Yet, and here is where that history-changing decision comes in, the king said, no, on the grounds that such a constitution and such an offer were an abridgment of the rights of princes of the individual German states. In a letter to his sister, Charlotte was her name, who was married to the Tsar of Russia at the time, he said he told the delegates, and I quote, "Sirs, you have not any right to offer me anything whatsoever. Ah, yes, you may ask, but give? No. For in order to give, you must first be in possession of something that can be given. And this is not the case." Unquote. In a later response, he observed, and once again I quote, "It would be like picking the crown up from the gutter." Unquote. So after all the preceding half-century of advances away from the old feudal way of thinking about the differences between noble blood and common blood, which I've spoken about many times, and after all the revolutions and yearning for a modern national state, it seems, at least in this case, for the time being, the old medieval ways still held sway over the new ways. In later statements, the king made it clear that he was indeed interested in leading a united German state, but the circumstances and the manner in which it came about must be right. In other words, he was a noble, and commoners cannot elevate a king because they have common blood flowing through their veins. That's basically what he's saying. So he couldn't accept it. It'd be like picking the crown up from the gutter, all muddy and dirty and greasy, grimy and nasty, you know? But sometimes, even movements that fail have a way of hanging around. They hang in there and eventually find favor. Over the next few years, Prussia's ministers took on a much more moderate policies and appearances. Rather than returning to bureaucratic rule after dismissing the Prussian National Assembly, Frederick William promulgated a new constitution that created a Parliament of Prussia with two chambers, an aristocratic upper house and an elected lower house. The lower house was elected by all taxpayers, but in a three-tiered, somewhat complicated three-tiered system based on the amount of taxes you pay, so that true universal suffrage was denied. In other words, the more taxes you paid, the more votes you got, the more representatives you got. The lower house, this was somewhat of a complicated system, which they were grouped into three classes, such that those were paid more tax were the first class, those that paid the least tax were the third class, and then aggregate tax revenue of each class made up the second class. Very complicated. Voters in each class separately elected 1/3 of the electors, who in turn voted for the representatives. But in the much smaller upper class, had far more power than the much larger lower class, reminiscent of the French estate system that brought on the French Revolution. The Constitution also reserved to the king the power of appointing all ministers, reestablished the conservative district assemblies and provincial diets, and guaranteed that the civil service and the military remained firmly in the hands of the king. This was a more liberal system than had existed in Prussia before 1848, but it was still a conservative system of government in which the monarch, the aristocracy, and the military retained most of the power. The Constitution remained in effect. This Constitution that Frederick William IV promulgated remained in effect until the dissolution of the Prussian kingdom in 1918. Okay. Following the revolutions of 1848, the increasingly gloomy king withdrew from the public eye, surrounding himself with advisors who preached absolute orthodoxy and conservatism in religious and political matters. A stroke in 1857 left the king partially paralyzed and largely mentally incapacitated. As his brother William served as regent from 1858 until the king's death 3 years later in 1861, at which point the regent acceded to the throne as William I of Prussia. There's William I, 1861 to 1888. He was the second son of Frederick William III of Prussia. In 1814, he fought in what Prussians called the German War of Liberation against Napoleon I, which of course was ultimately successful. Subsequently, he devoted himself to the Prussian army and military affairs, see him wearing his uniform there. In 1840, on the accession of his childless eldest brother, Frederick William IV, he became Prince of Prussia and heir presumptive. When revolution broke out in Berlin in March of 1848, William's advocacy of force against the revolutionists earned him the nickname Prince of Grapeshot. After a brief self-imposed exile in England, he returned to Prussia in June of 1848, and in 1849 he commanded troops, the troops that were sent to suppress the insurrection at Baden. William's innate mistrust of constitutionalism was mitigated by the lessons of the 1848 revolt, by his exposure to English political ideas, and the influence of his consort, his wife, Augusta Saxe-Weimar-Eisenbach. He married this witty and temperamental princess in 1829 after renouncing an ongoing love affair with Princess Eliza Radziwill, because it was pointed out to his father that her family, Radziwill's family, bought their nobility from the Holy Roman Emperor back in the early 16th century, which apparently is a no-no, which made her nobility and therefore her suitability to marry a Prussian king questionable to the Prussian court. It's that noble versus common blood thing again, you know. And by the way, that name Radziwill may ring a bell. Yeah, Jacqueline Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy was related to the Radziwills one way or another. So who knows? William was appointed military governor of the Rhineland province in 1849 and made his residence at Koblenz, a liberal center of opposition to the reactionary policies of Frederick William IV, which he turned to later in his reign, as I told you. As evidence of his softening political opinions, he earlier described Otto von Bismarck's ideas as schoolboys' politics. As mentioned earlier, from 1858 on, William was regent to his ailing brother, and on January 2nd, 1861, William succeeded to the Prussian throne upon Frederick William IV's death. As regent, he made himself popular by proclaiming a new era of liberalism, but he opposed a ministry comprising conservatives he appointed a ministry comprising of conservatives with a sprinkling of moderate liberals. Perhaps the event that most shaped William's reign was the war between Austria and Sardinia, which I talked about earlier, but I'm going to quickly run through it again here. Very, very important war. It's called the Second War of Italian Unification. We discussed this war But we're going to see how it affected Prussia here. Sometimes when you discuss other nations, we have to recap the original event because it's no accident. It's no accident that one event sometimes affects other events. And this is certainly the case. The unifications of both Italy and Germany were accomplished within a decade of each other. That's no accident. The cultural prehistory of the German nation state extends back into and beyond the 18th century. But the chain of events that made its foundation a political possibility began with the Second War of Italian unification. You remember what Italy looked like here in 1829. All these different kingdoms, Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. This is Sardinia, which included the island of Sardinia in this area, called the Piedmont, with its capital here at Turin. The Papal States, ruled by the Pope, Tuscany and several other areas there, the small Italian states. In April of 1859, the Austrian Empire declared war. Austria declared war on the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. You'll recall, because it was being the Piedmont Prime Minister, this happened in the summer of 1858, the Prime Minister was a man named Camille de Cavour, a genius as far as political maneuverings is concerned. He had earlier negotiated a secret defense alliance, a treaty with France, who was ruled by Napoleon III, a very, 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 very vain man, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. In the spring of 1859, Cavour provoked a war with Austria. He knew he could in no way defeat the mighty Habsburgs, but with France on his side, that changes the equation. So he purposely provoked a war with Austria by massing Piedmontese troops on the northern border it shared with Austrian Lombardy, still on the map there. Austrian Lombardy is right here, okay? And of course, the Austrians attacked. Austria declared war. And this activated the treaty which obligated France to support the Italian, Piedmont. And French troops rushed southwards across the Alps in the first major mobilization by railway ever to occur in modern European history. Between the end of April and the beginning of July, the joint French-Piedmont forces occupied Lombardy, winning two major victories against the Austrians. Piedmont annexed the Duchy of Lombardy and the duchies of Parma, Modena, and Tuscany. And a lot of the papal territory was eventually coaxed into a union with Piedmont. Piedmont now controlled almost all of the northern part of the Italian peninsula, and things might have stayed that way had it not been for the invasion of the south by a band of volunteers under the command of Giuseppe Garibaldi. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies quickly collapsed, clearing the way for the unification of most of the peninsula under the rule of the Piedmontese monarchy. But they didn't call themselves Piedmont anymore. They called themselves the Kingdom of Italy, which it still is, of course, today. Now, it's not 100%. Papal State's still there, the Vatican, and San Marino's still there. That's an independent nation, too. But 99% of it is unified with Italy. This Italian war set Prussian national policy on a new footing, aimed now at unification of all non-Austrian German states with Prussia. It was obvious to contemporaries that there were many parallels between the Italian and the German unifications. In both cases, a strong sense within especially the educated elite of historical, cultural, and nationalistic ties to Prussia. In both cases, it was Austria that stood in the way of national consolidation. It is also ironic that in Austria's case, nationalism divided the Austrian Empire, whereas in Prussia's case, it will unite the Prussian Empire. There were also clear parallels between Piedmont and Prussia. Both states were noted for their confident bureaucracies and their modernizing reforms, and both were constitutional monarchies, at least since 1848 they were. Each had sought to suppress popular nationalism, while at the same time maneuvering to extend its own influence in the name of the nation over the lesser states within its geographic sphere of influence. It was thus easy for almost anyone to project the Italian events of 1859-61 to the German political map. The Italian War also demonstrated that new doors had opened within the European political system. Most important of these was the estrangement between Austria and Russia. In 1848, the Russians had saved the Austrian Empire from partition at the hands of the Hungarian national movement. During the Crimean War of 1854-56, however, the Austrians had made the fateful decision to join the anti-Russian coalition led by Britain and France, a move that was seen in St. Petersburg as outright treachery and betrayal. Vienna therefore irretrievably forfeited any future Russian support that had once been the cornerstone of its foreign policy. Cavour was the first European politician to show how this realignment could be exploited to his state's advantage. This idea of exploiting events like this for your own political advantage was given a name. It was called realpolitik, real politics. Question? The events of 1859 were instructive in other ways as well. Under Napoleon III, France emerged as a power prepared to challenge by force the European order established by the Congress of Vienna way back in 1815. The Prussians now felt the ancestral threat from the West more keenly than ever. In other words, they were now fearful of France. The shock effect of the French intervention in Italy was heightened by memories of the first Napoleon, whose ascendancy had begun with the subjugation of the Italian peninsula. That's where he gained his fame as a general, and continued with the invasion of the Rhineland. The Prussian mobilization of 1859, in which Prussian troops were concentrated in the Rhineland to deter Napoleon III from even thinking about extending into Germany, may not have been the disaster some historians have described, but it did nothing to allay the sense of German vulnerability to a resurgent Bonapartist France. As for the Austrians, they had fought bitterly to keep their Italian possessions, inflicting 18,000, count them, 18,000 casualties on the Franco-Piedmontese in the just discussed war. Would they not also fight to defend their political preeminence within a divided Germany? Prussia's position was in some respects worse than Piedmont's, for it seemed clear that the middle states of the Third Germany, as it was called, neither Prussian nor Austrian, all the other German states, unlike the lesser northern Italian principalities, would support Austria if push came to shove, if there was any struggle between the two potential German giants. Almost all Germany for the last 40 years has cherished a hostile spirit against Prussia, said William I on March 26, 1860, and for a year, this has decidedly been on the increase. The Italian War was thus a reminder of the importance of armed force to the resolution of entrenched power political conflicts. And the view gained ground that within military leadership, that Prussia would have to reform and strengthen its army if it was to meet the challenges facing it in the near future. This was not a new problem. Since the 1810s, financial constraints had meant that the size of the army had not kept pace with the growth of the Prussian population. By the 1850s, only about 1/2 of the young men of eligible age were being drafted. There were also concerns about the quality of the local militia created to fight Napoleon in earlier military reformers, and its officers were trained to much less exacting standards than they were before. Leading the campaign for reform was none other than William I, Prince William of Prussia at the time. He was already a 62-year-old man. when he began in 1858 to rule for his older brother, who, as mentioned earlier, had been incapacitated by a series of strokes. William's emotional attachment to the Prussian army was deeply rooted in his biography. He had worn a uniform since the age of 6. On January 1st, 1807, at the age of 9, he received his ensign's commission, together with promotion to lieutenant as a Christmas present. His earliest experiences in service were bound up with the memory of invasion and the flight of the royal family to East Prussia during the Napoleonic Wars. Unlike his more mentally agile elder brother, William disliked his lessons and was never happier than when in the company of his fellow cadets and his military tutors. It is easy to imagine how important the companionable routines of service must have become after the trauma of his mother's death in 1810. William's devotion was focused on the regular army of the line, not on the militias. William was repelled by the civilian makeup of the local militias, which he regarded as both militarily ineffective and politically unreliable. The major hurdle in this reorganization of the Prussian military was going to be the Parliament, which had gained the power of the purse strings and in the many revolts and concessions since 1848. Early in 1861, the government presented 2 bills to Parliament, one calling for the military reforms and the other to fund it. William felt that the former bill was part of his prerogative as king, and the second was in the sphere of Parliament, since he now accepted that funding was a legislative matter. The bills were approved, but only provisionally. That is, Parliament reserved the right to make changes to the modernization plan of the army in the future. But the reforms could at least begin. But over the next, few months or so, the issue became one of increasing national debate. The anti-military liberals began to pressure the Parliament to dropping the modernization program altogether. So William decided to play what we call parliamentary roulette. He dismissed the Parliament and called for new elections, hoping to win a conservative majority in the next election. He seriously miscalculated, as the new Parliament was even more liberal than ever. In these contentious days, William even considered abdicating in favor of his son Frederick, who was sympathetic to the liberals. But the king was persuaded not to and adopted a different measure of last resort. He seriously miscalculated because he ended up with a parliament far more liberal than it was before. And what he did instead, he was persuaded not to, but by his advisors, he adopted what he called a measure of last resort by appointing a young Prussian by the name of Otto von Bismarck as Minister President of Prussia. According to the Prussian Constitution, the Minister President was responsible solely to the king, not to the Parliament or anyone else. Bismarck, a conservative Prussian Junker, remember the Junkers, the Junghers, and a loyal friend of the king, liked to see his working relationship with William as that of a vassal to his feudal superior. Nonetheless, it was Bismarck who now effectively directed the politics of the Prussian nation, domestic as well as foreign, as we will see. And he became more indispensable to the crown. He acquired the habit and skill of gaining William's assent. Every time the king disagreed with him, all he had to do was threaten to resign. And the king would say, no, don't do that, don't do that. Which more often, he played that trick many times, and it worked like a charm every time. So let's talk about this Otto von Bismarck, which, as you can guess, will probably take us quite a while, because he's the father of modern Germany. He's the guy that created the nation of Germany. So rather than get started on that, and there are a lot of things, he's called the Iron Chancellor, and His favorite expression was blood and iron. The major squabbles of the day will be settled by blood and iron, which he meant war. Quite a guy, quite an enigma too. I just called him a conservative, but there are liberals who consider him one of them too. So go figure. He was a bit of an enigma. And so let's start next time with that. Let's end right now with that. And see you next time, March 3rd. Same time, same place. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.